Please stand clear of the doors. Por favor, manténganse alejado de las puertas.
Hey there everybody, and welcome back to Monorail Monday. It's episode 36 in our 6th season of stories from my time working at Disney, operational stories, stories behind the scenes, crazy guest stories and things like that. So let's get started talking about what today's topic is. Today we're going to talk about 5-car monorails and the Mark IVs. The Mark IVs were the original trains that you see. They were a little shorter, a little narrower. They held about 240 people as opposed to the Mark VIs, which currently hold around 350, 60 people. So the Mark IVs were originally the original 10 trains, the original colors minus lime and coral, which did come out later. The original 10 trains were 5-car trains. They could hold 204 people, and the 6-car expansion later brought that to 244. But they were originally 5-car trains, and Disney did intend to expand the trains at some point in the future. Now that started, I guess the planning on that started in the mid to late 70s. And so they started converting and adding a 6-car to the trains to make them 6-car trains. And that happened over time, and not all of them did get converted from 5-cars. If you look at some of the old videos, some of the old footage from Disney, original early Disney pictures, you look at the monorails, most of them will have the 5 cars instead of 6. That's one way that you look at something, you can say, okay, this is early 70s Disney, as you can see those 5-car trains. Though a couple of them stayed 5-car trains for a lot longer. We'll get to that in a minute. So with the 5-car trains, the stations of the hotels were designed for the 5-car trains, which were of course the Contemporary and the Polynesian, and eventually the Grand Floridian came around, but by the time that came around, they designed that for the 6 trains. So the original 2 hotels, the Contemporary and the Polynesian, both sat with a 5-car long loading platform. So for a while, once the original Mark IVs started getting converted, they only put the 5-car trains on the resort line because you had a couple of stations there that could only accommodate 5 cars on the train. Now those 2 stations were later expanded so that the platform is lengthened and it can accommodate those 6-car trains, because when the Mark VIs came along, they were all 6 cars. Everything was 6 cars. But early on, you couldn't put those trains on there because one train door would potentially open up to no platform. So they kept those to 5 cars. The Magic Kingdom and the Transportation Center were originally designed to accommodate longer trains. So they didn't need to expand those. When they added the 6-car, there was plenty of space to accommodate that. So the I think it was Yellow was the first train to be converted to a 6-car. I could be wrong on that, but I think that was true. So over time, a handful of these trains were being converted, and so for a portion of the time in the late 70s, early 80s, you had some of the trains, maybe half the trains, converted to 6 cars, the other converted or still at a 5-car status. This meant you had to know what train was coming in next as to what gates you could load, if you were loading gates at any particular station, and you had to know what cars would be available. In particular, the Magic Kingdom, if you had gates, you couldn't load the last car if it was only a 5-car train, because you only have 5 cars worth of people, so you couldn't load this for this one. The next one would have 6 cars, so you could load all the gates at the train station. So I had to be keeping an eye on that. On the resort beam, you didn't really have to worry about that as much because everything was coming in 5 cars. That's something you had to be aware of. Which train has 6 cars, which train has 5 cars, and in addition to that, you also had to worry about numbering. The trains are generally numbered. Cab 1 is the pilot cab, and then you have cars 2, 3, 4, 5. The other cab is 6. That's what it's like on the current Mark 6 monorails. Now, when you went from the 5, when you had 5, it was car 1 was operating cab and the first passenger cab, and then it was train number 5 or cab 5. That was the other end, and you could drive out of either end. You just have to have it powered up from one end or the other. So you can operate out of either end, and it was 1 through 5. Now when you add the 6 train, you are getting into, you could have some trains with 1 and some trains with 6. So what they ended up doing is they ended up calling the 4th car 3A on the 6-car trains, so that you would end up, instead of 4, 5, 6, you would end up with 3A, 4, 5. And that way you ended up with cab 1 and cab 5 are the same for 5-car and 6-car trains. So you can refer to, I'm in cab 5, and it doesn't matter what train you're in, the smaller one or the longer one, that would allow you to maintain the same numbers, and especially when talking on the radio and things like that, to keep things the same across all the monorails. So that's a little bit of how that started. Now, of course, eventually in the mid-80s, around 1984, I think it was 84, that both Coral and Lime were added as trains 11 and 12, and they came with a 6th car in it. And they, of course, had the blue interior already in there. They were switching some of these trains from the brown to the blue interior with the 6th car. But those trains came on in the mid-80s or so, and eventually you had all the trains had been expanded to 6 cars except for blue and gold. Blue and gold were the only 2 Mark IV trains that never did make the conversion. And this is because, well, at the point that they had gotten to those 2, they had already decided they were going to add the Mark VIs. So they didn't bother with upgrading those trains and extending them, because there's no point in adding a 6th car to an old train when you're going to replace them in the next couple of years anyway. So gold and blue were the last 2. Now, blue had a lot of issues, a lot of maintenance issues. It was basically being used for spare parts for other trains, and it was not running that well. So that was one of the first ones designated to go off. It was the first one to go off, basically, and be retired. They used that as a prototype for doing some things, like they had to expand the entrances and exits, the portals in the Contemporary Hotel, to accommodate the larger Mark VI trains, because they were taller and they were just a little bit fatter on the edges. So they had to expand those. So blue was used for a lot of utility things, and it was not used that much at the end. So at the end, you got 2 trains that are still 5-car. You got to watch for the one train that is a 5-car train, to know when that's coming around, when you are going to be able to load it. There are a couple of times with gold where you would have somebody who filled up all the gates. Oh, this train's only 5-car. They forgot. And then people get mad. Why aren't we getting on? There's not a car for us. That happened a couple times. But basically, gold was the last operating 5-car train until they were replaced with the new Mark VI train. When the Mark VI trains, you could fill all of those cars if you didn't have to worry about it. Standing room was the biggest challenge. I don't know, to me, one of the biggest challenges with people with the new trains was they weren't used to standing room, and people really rebelled against that sort of thing. Just prior to the arrival of the Mark VIs, they did expand the Contemporary and the Polynesian to accommodate a 6-car train. So the rule of 5-car trains only on the resort line kind of went away, and you basically had the platforms extended. The Grand Floridian, of course, was built with 6-car trains in mind, so that was already, by the time that came online, it was already taken care of. So that, and of course, the doors are one of people's favorite things about the Mark IV trains. Anybody who rode or drove or visited Disney during the 70s and 80s when the Mark IVs were running loved the sound of the ka-chunk of all the doors popping open, and then the slam, 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 slam as the cast members went and pushed the doors shut, all manually, unlike today's automated Mark VIs. That was a lot of fun. You just had to be sure you weren't pushing the door in on somebody's hands. You had to be very careful. That happened a few times, probably more than a few times. So that was pretty cool period of time. The original trains were built by Martin Marietta, and they started with 10. They added 2 more, and then those 2 continued on with the Mark VIs when they got those on. So you got, and over time, once we got the new Mark VIs on, we lose a Mark IV train. The Mark VI trains would go through testing, and they had to have a certain number of miles before they were allowed to enter passenger service. Most of the time we were doing testing overnight or during the day, when they would say, okay, Monorail yellow is going to run on the express beam, but we're not putting anybody on that. So that train would come in, then it would get dispatched, and they just run around empty during the day, when having an empty train running around wouldn't be as much of a problem when it was a little quieter. But by and large, they were doing testing overnight in the evenings, so they could have equipment all over the cab, and they could do things and stop the system without clogging up the rest of the operation. If you run the Mark VI train too much during the day, if you need to do some work on the Mark VI monorail, or you need to stop for a minute, you can't hold up the rest of the operation. That train needs to continuously be cycling. Overnight, you can run it a bunch of times around. You can stop and have it sit in the station for an hour, and it's not causing any problems to the rest of the system. So that was that's a little bit of the transition that happened. The Mark IVs were the Mark VIs are fun to drive. The Mark IVs were even more fun to drive. It was a little more mechanical. It's kind of like, I would imagine, I've not flown aircraft other than flight simulator games online, but I would say it's probably akin to flying an older aircraft, a DC-9, a 747 or something, versus a new Airbus where you got it's like basically a joystick and it's all digital. Flying one of those older ones, probably a little bit more fun, or there's just a little more stuff for you to do, and not as much automation and digital in there. So the original trains were pretty fun to drive. They were workhorses, and you could work your way around the governor quite often, especially with the 5-car trains, where you could get a little bit more speed going because they were a little bit lighter. And on the Epcot beam, you could get those things going pretty fast. So that was a little bit fun, and I think I've mentioned in one of my previous videos, but when it comes to the trains, you're driving the trains, the old Mark IVs had the power button, or the power handle. Not doing too good with the brain here today, but there was a little button here that you would push, and that was your deadband. You had to hold that in, and the train would move. If you let go of it, the train would stop. You had to hold that button in, the deadband button in. People could take their gooseneck microphone and bend that over to push the button in and hold it in, so that you could basically have a sort of an autopilot in a way. And the Mark VI trains, you had a little grip handle, and you basically turned it so that would be your deadband. And if you let go of it, just snaps back to the other position. You had to basically physically hold it in the straight ahead position, otherwise it would snap back to the side cockeyed, and that would stop the train automatically. So if somebody wasn't holding on and powering it, the train wouldn't move. So I think that's covering a little bit of the 5-car trains and the 6-car trains, a little bit more about the Mark IVs. The Mark IVs were a lot of fun to drive. They really were. But I drove, for the most part, I drove the Mark VIs. It was a very, very short period of time that I had to drive Mark IVs, but they were a lot of fun. So hopefully you enjoyed some of this. We are going to do some more videos coming up soon with more technical stuff that a couple people have asked about. And thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, share, tell your friends. And remember, most importantly, have a good time all the time.